I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. They are Steve and Susie Swatt, and many of you may recognize Mr. Swatt from his 23 years working at KCRA, covering mostly politics in the legislature. He spent 50 years of his career working in political analysis. And his beautiful wife, Susie Swatt, has worked in the legislature for 40 years. Together, they've authored 3 books. Tonight, they're going to be talking about one of their recent books, Paving the Way. Please, without further ado, welcome Steve and Susie Swatt.
Well, first of all, it's great to be back talking to you. It was 2016 when we were talking about our first book, which was called Game Changers, 12 Elections That Transformed California. And what is so interesting about that is that after we finished that book, and it did really well and won a number of awards, we realized, without even thinking about it, that all the individuals that we talked about in these game-changing elections were men. I mean, you're going back to Leland Stanford and William Mulholland and Howard Jarvis and you name it, Hiram Johnson and things like that. And so we realized that there was very little history about women coming through the political process in California going back to the gold rush. And one of the reasons, of course, they were discriminated against. There were cultural stereotypes, but they were able to overcome those, especially in more recent years, through grit and determination and resilience. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to tell you some stories about some of these women. You've probably never heard of many of them or most of them, but they did remarkable things. And unfortunately, most of them are lost to history. So we got our information by going to various libraries up and down the state, oral histories, academic reports, interviews, newspapers going back to the beginning of statehood. So let me start off with that. Women's suffrage in the U.S. had been on the public's radar since 1848, the year gold was discovered in neighboring El Dorado County. A group of activists met in Seneca Falls, New York, and decried what they called the grievous bondage of women. And in 1878, it was a Northern Californian, Aaron Sargent, who was in the U.S. Senate from Nevada City, who first introduced those 29 words that decades later would become the 19th Amendment, granting suffrage to women nationwide. And there might have been some pillow talk at work here, because the senator's wife, Ellen Sargent, was a leading voting rights advocate and later a friend of suffragist Susan B. Anthony. But while the women in the East were consumed by the fight for suffrage, women in the new, raw, undeveloped state of California had other concerns, and their stories are really inspiring. Take, for example, Bridget Biddy Mason. She was born into slavery in Georgia. She then was relocated to Mississippi and was forced to walk 2,000 miles behind a covered wagon to Utah and then San Bernardino in the early years of the gold rush. California at that time was a free state, but her master wouldn't let her go and give her freedom. So she went to court, even though blacks back then could not testify against whites, and she won. After winning her freedom in 1856, Biddy Mason moved her family to the tiny pueblo of Los Angeles. At that time, population 4,000. She worked as a midwife and a nurse. She saved her money, and with $250, she bought some real estate in just what happened to become years later downtown LA. She sold it for $300,000, and she basically became a real estate entrepreneur. $300,000 is worth about $11 million today. She became very wealthy. She fed and housed the poor. She helped prisoners. She built the first black school in Los Angeles and the city's first African-American church. In San Francisco, meanwhile, Mary Ellen Pleasant, another former slave, also used the courts to stand up for her rights. In the 1860s, that's nearly 100 years before Rosa Parks, she sued a San Francisco streetcar company for refusing to let her and other African Americans ride in their cars. She forced the company to change its policy. She had been a cook in a boarding house for well-to-do men in San Francisco. She eavesdropped on the men when they talked about their investments. And so she put some money that she had from her first husband into stock, Wells Fargo and mining stock. And she got pretty rich with all of that. She ended up helping finance John Brown's raids on Harper's Ferry, and he used much of her money and fortune to shelter and find work for runaway slaves. In the mid-1870s, in San Jose, Clara Foltz and her 5 small children were abandoned by her husband, and to feed her family, she became a paid lecturer on women's suffrage. But she really wanted to be a lawyer. Her father was a lawyer, but state law then prohibited women from becoming lawyers. So she convinced her state senator, to carry legislation to open the door for women, and commuted to Sacramento to help lobby the bill's passage in 1878. Now all she needed was the governor's signature, and that's an interesting story. She and other lobbyists waited outside Governor William Irwin's office in the hours before his midnight deadline for action. Suddenly, a man burst through the door and said, "The lady lawyer bill is dead." Devastated and angry, Foltz then slipped into the governor's office when the guard's back was turned. She made her way into the governor's inner office where he was signing and vetoing bills. Nervous and trembling, she told him, "This is an important bill," and he fished the bill out of the veto pile, looked at it, looked up at her and said, "You know, you're right. This is an important bill. I'm going to sign it." And he did. Years later, Foltz published a woman's magazine and serialized her life story. She said, just seconds after the governor signed that bill, the clock struck 12. In those days, you didn't have to go to law school to become a lawyer. And Clara had already passed the bar, but she still wanted a law school education because she thought that would benefit her clients. So she plunked down her $10 tuition to go to Hastings Law School in San Francisco. But after 3 days, she and a female colleague by the name of Laura DeForest Gordon were kicked out of the school, ushered out and kicked out, because old man Hastings, who gave the money for the school, didn't want women in there. So they decided to sue the school, and it went all the way up to the state Supreme Court. They argued their own case and ended up winning. Now, Foltz is merely a footnote today, but she was the first female lawyer in California, the first female deputy DA in U.S. history, and a leading suffragist. DeForest Gordon, meanwhile, who lived in San Joaquin County, was the second woman lawyer in California. After those important victories, both Foltz and Gordon turned their attention and their considerable talents to women's suffrage. Now, in 1869, Wyoming, a territory at that time with 9,000 residents, had become a pioneer in gender equality, as it was the first territory or state to give women the vote. One reason, almost all of those 9,000 citizens were men. And they thought, gee, if we could give women the vote, we would attract women to Wyoming, our population would grow rapidly, and we'd become a state and not just a territory. It worked. Even before Wyoming's breakthrough, the Sacramento Union had editorialized in favor of women's suffrage. This is 1869. In its coverage of Sacramento County's Republican convention of that year, the Union said women are citizens and that Republicans should not deny them suffrage. Around the same time, a woman by the name of Emily Pitts Stevens, a brash, self-described female revolutionist, was earning a place in the pantheon of early suffrage advocates and opinion leaders. Her detractors called her Pitsy. She bought a San Francisco newspaper called the Mercury and turned it into the first suffrage journal in the West. She hired women to set type in defiance of the Printers Union, and she helped found the California Women's Suffrage Association. She also created quite a stir. The San Francisco Examiner called it a clamor when she and some friends disrupted a lecture by an anti-suffragist in the city's venerable Platts Hall. The news accounts indicated that the women continuously mocked the speaker. When an anti-suffrage San Francisco assemblyman in the audience tried to quiet her down, she reportedly drew a pistol on him. And under the headline of female hoodlums and rowdy women, The Sacramento Bee called it a disgraceful scene. In 1896, California voters, all male, of course, were given the opportunity to weigh in on suffrage. Famed suffragist Susan B. Anthony was brought in to California to help manage the campaign. She made numerous stops in Sacramento during that campaign. One speech was at the old Metropolitan Theater on K Street between 4th and 5th. But self-inflicted wounds hurt the cause. The campaign targeted middle and upper middle class white men, excluding other populations. And the campaign focused on major cities to the exclusion of the state's rural areas. In a social gossip column of the Sacramento Record Union, we found that an unidentified author said that she and her woman friends had no sympathy for the suffrage movement. She said females spouting politics and howling about the rights of women are as out of place as a man in the kitchen. Women, she said, should be content to leave affairs of state to men who are better fitted by nature to contend with them. Shortly before the election, Anthony and another leading suffragist, Carrie Chapman Catt, campaigned in Sacramento and said the eyes of the nation are on California. Catt said universities are turning out women graduates by the thousands, and that 1 in 4 women are breadwinners for the family. If women were capable of earning a living, managing property, and acquiring education, they can be trusted with the ballot. Minority women excluded from the white suffrage clubs ran their own campaign for the vote. Still, Naomi Anderson, who was called the colored suffrage evangelist, was invited to speak to the State Suffrage Association convention. She said the daughters of America have been compelled to kiss the dust and drink the dregs of womanhood. Many women back then had been closely identified with the temperance movement, and the liquor industry feared that women voters would enact prohibition ordinances throughout the state. The industry was extremely powerful in the large cities of San Francisco and Oakland. It mobilized a last-minute statewide attack, sending flyers to every bar, every restaurant, liquor store, and boarding house, warning customers that their next beer could be their last. On election night, the Sacramento Record Union posted results on a large illuminated bulletin board outside its building on 3rd Street. But the liquor industry's coordinated opposition worked. The measure lost in Sacramento County, as it did in 35 other counties. In immigrant communities, especially, where liquor was a cultural staple, the men turned on the women. In San Francisco, which was by far the largest city in the state then, and one which seemed to have a tavern on every street corner, the vote against suffrage was 3-1. For the next 15 years, suffrage advocates were in despair. Many suffrage clubs folded. Mary McHenry Keith of Berkeley almost single-handedly held the movement together, at one point writing a personal check for $500 for the state's Equal Suffrage Association, and that's the equivalent of $19,000 today. Catherine Reed Ballantyne published what was called the Yellow Ribbon in San Francisco, which was devoted to the suffrage movement. Copies of the Yellow Ribbon are held at the California State Library. Ballantyne scored an interview with President Roosevelt, a friend of her father. The result was disappointing, though, because he said, quote, public sentiment was not yet strong enough for him to do anything about women's voting rights. To be sure, there were many villains in the long suffrage battle, but none quite as nefarious as Republican James Gillette. At the 1906 State Republican Convention in Santa Cruz, Gillette struck up a conversation with a leading suffragist and told her that he was a candidate to be the party's nominee for governor. He said he believed in their cause, and he promised that should he win the nomination and then the general election, women would have a friend in the governor's office. And Gillette did win. But when suffragist Lillian Coffin asked him to fulfill his pledge to the suffrage cause, he replied, I was only joshing you. I didn't mean what I said. Besides, he continued, women belonged at home taking care of the kids. With Gillette and subsequent governors now sitting on the sidelines, one attempt after another was defeated by the legislature. During one session, a member of supposedly pro-suffrage senators missed the vote when they were kicking back in the lounge smoking cigars. Publicly, they said their oversight was inadvertent. Ridiculed, ignored, and deceived, women tried a new tack, civic improvement. They formed women's clubs up and down the state. They couldn't vote, but they convinced presidents, governors, and legislatures to save large swaths of ancient redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains and the North Coast and in the Sierra foothills. They investigated tainted milk in Southern California that put infants at risk and discovered that many dairy cows had tuberculosis. Their work led to greater government oversight. In the Bay Area, after the 1906 earthquake, women worked closely with health officials to rid cities of infestation of rats that carried the bubonic plague. The women made a strategic decision to hitch their wagon to Hiram Johnson and the Progressives, who had split from the main Republican Party. The Progressives were primarily focused on breaking up the octopus, the derisive term used to describe the Southern Pacific Railroad and its abusive monopoly that controlled every facet of commerce and politics in the state of California. The suffragists and the Progressives found common cause in pushing the idea of political reform. Their message, simple: if men had made such a mess of politics, why not let women try to clean it up? Reform-minded males believed they couldn't clean up the government without the help of women's votes, and the women believed that by supporting the Progressives, they'd be rewarded if Progressives captured the state government, which they did in 1910. And the Progressives, true to their word, put a suffrage measure on the statewide election ballot in 1911. Now, Selena Solomon was a leading suffragist from San Francisco. She understood that to be successful, this campaign had to expand beyond the socially elite, and she was a member of the socially elite, and overcome the class divisions that were prevalent earlier in 1896. Minority women still had to conduct their own campaign, but working class women, the shop girls, the clerks, and the secretaries, were brought into the movement. Solomon's came from a prominent San Francisco family, but she connected with the working class. She created the Votes for Women Club in a loft on Sutter Street and invited working women to come in for an affordable lunch. An entree or salad cost 5 cents. Once there, they listened to lectures and were given campaign materials to take back to their neighborhoods so the women could work on their brothers, their husbands, their fathers, and their boyfriends. The women devised unusual publicity stunts to boost visibility. One of their biggest problems always was trying to attract men, the actual voters, to their suffrage speeches. And that's when they had a brainstorm. Very clever. They enlisted the aid of a spiffy 1910 Packard touring car as a man magnet. The car was quite the attraction. It was a convertible. It sat 7 people. It was the fanciest car on the road. New, back then, it cost $4,000. The equivalent of 7 to 8 times the average Californian's annual salary. They called it the Blue Liner. They would drive it to a busy street corner and park it. A boy with a bugle then would blow the horn and attract attention. And then the women would wait for the men to come out of the woodwork. The men would come by and stop and kick the tires, look under the hood, admire the upholstery, and generally see what the fuss was all about. And then, once a large crowd gathered, the women would pop up and give them a speech. One newspaper reported that at 3 separate stops in San Francisco, the car and the women attracted more than 1,000 voters and lots of reporters. The Los Angeles Times, meanwhile, during that election, and its blustery publisher, Harrison Gray Otis, led the campaign against suffrage. Women, he said, should not be burdened with the duty and responsibility of voting. 9 days before the election, it was an article by Senator J.B. Sanford, a state senator, and in the Los Angeles Times, he wrote an op-ed piece, and what he said was, in near hysterics, he argued that women's suffrage was a disease that caused divorces and crime. He said it was only supported by, quote, mannish female politicians, sissy men, and women who wished they had been born men. Susan B. Anthony once said of Sanford, as his species would soon be extinct, she would advise canning him for the benefit of posterity. The San Francisco Chronicle called her a female agitator. The Blue Liner also ferried speakers to small towns up and down California, as well as remote factories and farms and ranches. The San Francisco Call ran a story about a society woman who gave up her luxurious home in Madera to ride horseback through the hills and mountains, giving small talks, often on horseback. The message was clear: women deserved a fair deal, a square deal, the ballot. And that's because women pay taxes to support government and obey the laws, and thus they should have something to say as to their making. Most California newspapers actually supported the suffrage amendment. In this Sacramento Bee cartoon, a man is sitting at his desk thinking, why shouldn't my mother vote? On Election Day, 1,000 women, fearful of tampering at the polls, kept a day-long watchful eye on the voting in San Francisco. At one polling place, a man came up to a poll watcher and said he was voting for suffrage, not because he believed in it, but based on the same theory he would use if he was having a bad tooth pulled. It had to be done sometime, he said, might as well get it over with. In Sacramento, the Equal Suffrage League had established headquarters at the 2-year-old $500,000 Hotel Sacramento at 10th and K Streets. Even San Francisco newspapers gushed over Sacramento's newest edition, what the San Francisco Call characterized as one of California's finest and most modern hotels. Sacramento suffragists fanned out to monitor polling places and reported results back to headquarters. Newspaper accounts said the women were received with respect. Selena Solomons, we talked about her earlier, wrote the only comprehensive account of the campaign, and she told of the total despair on election night as the first returns came in, mostly from San Francisco, the largest city in the state, which indicated that the suffrage effort was losing by a large margin. The day after the election, the Sacramento Bee reported that the county, Sacramento County, had supported the voting rights measure this time, but statewide it said the measure had been defeated. Campaign leaders licked their wounds and plotted strategy for the next suffrage attempt. And then something unexpected happened. Late uncounted votes started trickling in from smaller towns, from farmers and ranchers and miners in the so-called cow counties, and they were breaking heavily for the suffrage movement. Despite the scare tactics of the liquor industry, the measure even passed in the wine-growing regions of Napa and Sonoma. 2 days after the election, the voting rights measure actually had pulled ahead, and it stayed that way. It eventually won by 3,500 votes statewide, equal to about 1 vote per precinct. And get this, Southern California, home of the rabidly anti-suffrage Los Angeles Times, put it over the top. And thus, California became the 6th and largest state to enact women's suffrage. Overnight, the vote enfranchised 600,000 women, doubling the number of females nationwide who could vote. The Sacramento Star, in an editorial titled, "What is Woman's Place?" said, "The old ideal as a woman as a parasite has largely passed away. It is a matter of elemental justice," it said, "that every human being of sound mind and mature age should have a part in making the law under which he or she must live." The Sacramento Bee welcomed the vote and said it speaks well for the men of the state. It also argued that suffrage is a duty, not just a privilege. It urged women to study politics and discuss candidates and measures. Women, it said, have an obligation to vote. And you remember that anti-suffragist Senator J.B. Sanford? He published a newspaper in Ukiah after the election, and he took one last swipe at the victorious women and their perceived vanity. He warned that when they registered the vote, quote, the girls would have to place on the public record their true ages and note any visible marks or scars. He figured that would keep them from registering. It didn't. As it turned out, the first major test of female voter enthusiasm was 2 months later, when Los Angeles held municipal elections. 70,000 women stood in long lines to register, and 65,000 of them voted. and that was a much higher percentage than men. Barely 4 months after the election, the Sacramento Star reported on rumblings that another ballot measure was in the works to reverse the election and revoke women's suffrage. It urged women to register quickly so they could help defeat it. As it turned out, it never happened. Meanwhile, triumphant California suffragists were going on the road to other states offering advice how to win the vote for them. Within months, Oregon, Arizona, Kansas gave women the vote. In fact, within 7 years, 9 states, including Michigan and New York, would approve women's suffrage, providing further impetus to those seeking an all-encompassing national suffrage amendment. Still, Congress balked, but California was moving forward. As president of Sacramento's Tuesday Literacy Club, Luella Johnston had once pushed an ordinance that banned new bars in residential areas. During the suffrage election, she ran a speakers bureau and canvassed Sacramento neighborhoods, and she was well regarded in the community. And in 1912, she became the first female council member of any city in state history, even though the Bee noted that some males would not admit that she has the brains to hold public office. She pledged to bolster levees on the Sacramento and the American rivers, and to enforce all gambling and prostitution laws. She wanted to develop a parcel of land owned by William Land and turn it into a park. Women ran her campaign. In fact, Johnston wasn't even the first female pioneer in Sacramento politics. Even before women could vote, they were permitted to run for what was considered a woman's job, superintendent of education or of schools. In 1907, Minnie O'Neill won election as superintendent. And in neighboring Placer County, Irene Burns served 12 years as superintendent, often visiting schools on horseback.
6 years later, in 1918, the first 4 women were elected to the state assembly: Grace Doris, Elizabeth Hughes, Esto Broughton, and Anna Saylor. They defeated their male candidates. 3 of the 4 were Northern Californians, and all of them had major accomplishments to their credit, from delivering water to farms in the San Joaquin Valley to enacting criminal justice reform, consumer protection, and minimum wage for women in the workplace. Esto Broughton of Modesto nearly died as a youngster when she contracted spinal tuberculosis that stunted her growth at 4 feet 6 inches and left her handicapped. She went to Cal, was on a championship women's crew, and she graduated with honors from the university's legal studies program, even though the dean argued that women were too emotional to become lawyers. At 28, she was elected to the assembly and became its expert on water and irrigation issues. Anna Saylor lived in Berkeley and had been president of the influential 20th Century Women's Club. After a fact-finding visit to San Quentin, she devoted her energies to criminal justice reform, such as separating women from men in prison, preventing boys as young as 8 years old from being housed in jails with hardened criminals, abolishing the death penalty for minors, and offering inmates psychiatric help. In the mid-1920s, as Director of Social Welfare, Saylor became the first woman to serve as in the governor's cabinet. A third pioneer in the legislature was Grace Doris of Bakersfield. Actually, her husband was slated to run for that seat, but he was sent overseas to fight in World War I. She took his place and campaigned against Kern County's wealthy land barons, who owned 1 million acres of property and financed her opponent. Her first bill, which later became law, improved working conditions for domestic workers. And from Oroville, Elizabeth Hughes became a leader in public education, boosting state funding for education and helping to grow Chico Normal School, which later became Chico State. During her campaign, her male opponent said women were too weak, that the legislature was no place for, and I quote, pink tea women. Hughes reminded voters that women nurses were saving American soldiers on the front lines in Europe. Voters sent her opponent packing. there was also tragedy in 1918, and it's timely more than 100 years later. It's a moving story not recorded in history books, but it's found in the pages of old newspapers. Mabel Anthony, a 37-year-old Oakland physician, had founded the San Francisco chapter of the American Women's League. She was prominent in California's women's equality movement. In 1918, she ran an aggressive campaign for the state Senate, along with a number of other females, but she failed to make it past the primary. Shortly after the election, her sister, who lived in the small copper mining town of Jerome, Arizona, contracted the Spanish flu during that nationwide pandemic. Dr. Anthony hurried to be at her sister's bedside, and she nursed her back to health. Then, at her own peril, she remained in Arizona to assist overwhelmed health officials with hundreds of other cases. Upon her return to Oakland, Dr. Anthony became ill herself. Then it was Dr. Anthony's sister, now recovered, who rushed to Mabel's bedside. But the westbound train that carried her from Arizona to California derailed near Needles, causing a lengthy delay. And by the time the train finally arrived in Oakland, it was too late. Dr. Anthony had died a few hours earlier, becoming one of 675,000 American fatalities in that flu pandemic. Meanwhile, the fight for national suffrage continued. There were parades and demonstrations, but more than anything else, the brutal treatment of some suffragists shocked the nation and galvanized public opinion. More than 30 women were arrested while protesting at the White House. They were held in dark, filthy cells. One woman lost consciousness when she hit her head after guards threw her against an iron bed. Another woman had a heart attack. Lucy Burns got the worst of it. When she first arrived in jail, she was stripped naked and shackled to the top of her cell, forcing her to stand up all night. She went on a hunger strike and was force-fed through a tube in her nose. Upon her release, Burns revealed her treatment in jail, what one reporter described as torture and brutality that would do credit to the Spanish Inquisition. The publicity moved many Americans, and in 1919, an Illinois congressman introduced the same suffrage measure that Aaron Sargent had sponsored 40 years earlier. The measure passed Congress and was sent to the state legislatures for ratification. Those first 4 California women lawmakers proudly cast their votes for ratification during a special legislative session. In fact, so did the men. The vote in the Assembly was 73-2, and it was 39-0 in the Senate, even though no one said a word of praise. To become law, the amendment needed 36 legislatures to agree, but it was stuck at 35. It all came down to Tennessee, but the southern states were adamantly opposed to the amendment, so the outlook appeared very bleak. The Tennessee Senate voted for suffrage, but the House vote was tied at 48-48 when 24-year-old Harry Byrne stood to cast the deciding vote. He already had voted to table the amendment until the following year, and people were convinced he would vote no. What they didn't know was that Byrne changed his mind after House pages delivered a letter to him shortly before the vote. It was from the most influential person in his life, his mother. Do the right thing, the letter said. Vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt. Byrne did what his mother told him to do. He put the letter in his coat pocket and cast the deciding vote for suffrage. Harry put it this way: I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow. I appreciated the fact that an opportunity to free 17 million women from political slavery was mine. After that California breakthrough election in 1918, only 10 other women would win assembly races in the ensuing 56 years. During the Depression, for example, it was expected that men, as the head of the household, deserved jobs before women in politics or the general workplace. During World War II, women who wanted to work were expected to serve the war effort in defense factories, not run for office. In fact, for 10 years, starting in 1942, Catherine Niehaus was the only female in the legislature, but women found other ways to affect public policy.
In mid-decade, Felicitas Mendez was incensed when her children were turned away at their neighborhood school in Orange County and sent to an inferior Mexican-American school that was separated from a smelly dairy by an electrified fence. She and her husband sued the school district, and in 1947 won a landmark desegregation case. They were helped by Thurgood Marshall, who 7 years later used the same arguments to win the momentous national desegregation case before the U.S. Supreme Court. In the 1950s, women were expected to stay home with the kids and take advantage of the new household conveniences. But outside of elective politics, women continued to make their mark, especially kickstarting the state's environmental movement. Los Angeles had experienced its first official smog attack in 1943. The air was so dirty, some people thought it was a Japanese gas attack during World War II. By the late 1950s, smog alerts were routine, and the putrid air was getting worse. These men in 1954, though, didn't let a little air pollution ruin their dinner meeting. A handful of Beverly Hills socialites were angry that their children were developing respiratory problems and couldn't even go outside. Some were wives of famous entertainers at the time, among them Art Linkletter, Bob Cummings. They formed a group called Stamp Out Smog, which galvanized public opinion with colorful protests. The women learned about catalytic converters and other smog abatement technology. They pressured government to act and at one time had hundreds of groups as coalition partners, representing tens of thousands of concerned citizens. Afton Slade, shown here with a birthday cake commemorating the 21st anniversary of that first smog attack, remembered being asked at a PTA meeting, sure, air pollution is bad, but what can a bunch of women do about it? Well, actually, Stamp Out Smog was credited with having a hand in 150 pieces of state and local legislation aimed at cleaning the air. Meanwhile, in Northern California, 3 women with ties to UC Berkeley were shocked to read a story in the Oakland Tribune that predicted dire ecological consequences if the city of Berkeley went forward with filling in 2,000 acres of San Francisco Bay. They formed Save the Bay, a grassroots organization that secured legislation that regulates the bay and its shoreline. And nationally, the women's movement had received a huge boost in 1960 with the government's approval of the birth control pill. That innovation enabled women to postpone childbearing while offering them opportunities to attend college and enter the workforce.
1966 was a breakthrough year. March Fong became the first Asian American woman to be elected to the legislature. Now, as you can see from the photo, she also smashed a toilet on the steps of the Capitol to push her bill banning paid toilets in state buildings. That was well before your time, but back then, in many public spaces, women had to carry around dimes to unlock public toilet stalls. She went on to become California's first female Secretary of State. Also in 1966, another barrier was broken as Yvonne Brathwaite became the first African-American woman elected to the legislature. She went on to Congress, then enjoyed a long career as a Los Angeles County supervisor. In our research, however, we came across a San Francisco Examiner headline that called these 2 new assemblywomen, and I quote, beautiful and brainy. The article didn't deal with their qualifications or platforms. Instead, it emphasized their hairdos and fashion choices. And it ran in the women's section of the newspaper. Now, in our research, we didn't find any stories that referred to bald male lawmakers and their taste in business suits. California did not have a woman state senator until the election of Democrat Roseanne Vuitch in 1976. That's 126 years after statehood. When a member stood on the floor and out of habit referred to gentlemen of the Senate, she would ring a bell, a small porcelain bell, to remind them of her presence. The state was so unprepared for her arrival, it didn't have a woman's restroom near the Senate floor. Today, there's a Rose Room dedicated in her honor. The early 90s brought more women running for office, thanks to term limits and redistricting. And for the first time in the history of our state, a woman was selected as a major party nominee for governor. Now, while Dianne Feinstein did not win in 1990, she and Barbara Boxer both won Senate seats in 1992, making California the first state to be represented by two females simultaneously in the Senate. They served together for 24 years until Boxer retired. Today, both California senators are men. California now has 4 female statewide constitutional officers serving at the same time, including the state's first woman lieutenant governor, Alani Kounalakis. But California remains one of only 18 states that has never elected a female governor, although 3 women have received major party nominations. Several women have indicated their plan to run for governor next year. And Californian Kamala Harris, of course, was only the second woman to win a major party nomination for president, after becoming the nation's first female vice president. After last November's elections, women now represent a majority in the state Senate for the first time. When I started in the legislature back in the early 1970s, there was only 3 women lawmakers, period. And the capital is more racially diverse than ever before, better reflecting the state's demographics. There are many reasons why women need to become key players in the development of public policy. Studies show that women are more prone than men to seek consensus on contentious matters, and consensus leads to problem solving. Further, women bring a different perspective to issues, and often they take up matters that men seem to ignore. With the gradual increase in female representation beginning in the 70s and 80s came more women staffers and consultants, more women lobbyists, more female Capitol reporters, and more attention to issues women care about. Further, and I speak from firsthand experience, there's finally a workable process to deal with sexual harassment. Ooh, I could tell you all sorts of personal stories of men behaving badly under the Capitol dome. And since growth at the state level often begins locally, it is encouraging that the list of city and county women office holders in California is growing every year. Women pioneers and activists have been battling the odds and taking political risks for 175 years now in California, and they've been making a difference, paving the way, if you will, since statehood becoming role models for future generations of leaders. And we'd be happy to answer any questions.
The dime charge tax for the bathrooms that March Fong was going against, were those just for women?
No, it was for anybody who wanted to use a stall.
Okay, that's what I was
And
just
since
curious.
men didn't need stalls as often as women,
Oh,
there's a
okay,
little
now I
discrimination
understand.
there.
Mhm, okay. All
You
right.
get it?
Yes, now I get it. Thank you.
Hi, Susie. You mentioned having personal experience. What was your role in the legislature?
I was really young when I started. Steve had brought me to Sacramento. I grew up in San Francisco. I thought, oh my God, where am I? But no, I really love Sacramento. Now, I was a little surprised when we first came here. I went in, it was through a friend of a friend of a friend that I got a job. And when the gentleman hired me, his name was Jerry Lewis, not the comedian. He told me, he was very honest with me. He says, I can only promise you 2 months. I was young. We didn't have many strings or whatever. So I said, fine. Because he says, look, you get your foot in the door. Well, it ended up that I worked for him for 7 years until he went to Congress. And he actually wanted Steve and I to go with him to Congress. But another gentleman that had worked for Jerry Lewis down in the district, which was down in Southern California, he won at the race and became a member of the state assembly, and he called me and hired me and then turned me into his chief staff. I was really lucky. I mean, really, and the things that I was involved with and got to know, I mean, it was amazing. I was really fortunate. It wasn't as partisan back then. It became far more partisan starting in the late 80s into the 90s. And beyond, but you could really get things done, and you could help the people of California, and to me, that's what we were there for. And many times, I mean, what I felt was very important, what I did, is people would call and have questions that involved very many different of the offices here, and they needed answers, and that's what we were there for. And that was really good to have. And I learned a lot, and I learned a lot about legislation, and I was right place, right time. It doesn't always happen.
Do you want to tell the story about sexual harassment? Anybody interested in that?
There was a gentleman who was a member of the assembly, and he would not leave me alone. He knew I was married. I mean, we'd been married before we moved up here. And what he would do, he'd come into my office, and they were very small offices back then, and I would be on the phone. He'd come over and start kissing my neck. There was nobody to go to. There was no female at that time, because it was the early 70s, to go to somebody and say, hey, help me, what do I do? So, I mean, he just wouldn't stop. I went to my boss, Jerry Lewis, and I said, hey, this is a problem. Can you talk to him? Well, he told me he did, which I believe it was partisan. Jerry was Republican. The other gentleman was a Democrat, and the Democrats had the power. Finally, what I had to do you want to relay the rest of it?
Yeah.
I was
So
so
she
upset.
comes home from work one night in tears and says, I'm quitting the Capitol. And I said, why? This was your dream. And she tells me the story about this guy. And the final straw was, back then at the Capitol, they had Xerox machines, not in the individual offices, but in the corridor. And she's at we have some former workers from the Capitol? All right. So she's Xeroxing, and this same assemblyman, comes up to her, starts kissing her again, from
I didn't
behind.
know it was him.
And just then, Pauline Davis, who was a member of the state assembly, first elected in 1952, she was like the Iron Lady of the assembly. She walks by and basically says, why don't you two get a room and do this on your own time? Susie is mortified. And I mean, she starts crying. She comes home and she says, I'm quitting. And I said, this is where I get to be the hero. I said, why don't you, don't quit yet. It was a Wednesday. There was a floor session on Thursday. Don't quit, excuse me? Thursday morning. I said, don't quit yet. I've got an idea. She says, okay. So I go to the Capitol to cover the assembly session. And back then, they would allow even reporters to go onto the assembly floor before the session was gavelled. So I got there early. This guy is standing in the middle of the floor talking to 3 other colleagues, and his back was to the press bay. So I just walked out from the press bay, walked up right behind him, and said, and he was looking the other way, I said, I understand you're harassing my wife. And he wheels around and sees it's me. Now, I wouldn't put that on TV, but I was on TV a lot back then, and I think he probably worried about how he might look if I did a story on that. And he goes, it'll never happen again. And it never happened again. So.
My hero.
Any other questions?
You cited the Chronicle and the Bee a lot, and I'm curious, I know the messaging around women of color and their role in the suffragette movement and politics in general was not as well documented, but I'm curious to hear a little bit more about like
minority newspapers?
yeah,
or,
like
or
the
outlets?
Observer and other newspapers that were starting to.
Well, yeah, even before the Observer, and this is really a good story, and we couldn't put all the stories in the book, and I've learned about this afterwards because, as I mentioned before, a lot of these stories are not in the history books, and you just sort of have to find them. But there was a woman by the name of Charlotta Bass, and she originally was from New York, and she came to California in 1910. And she started working for the California Eagle, which was a black newspaper, and was based in Los Angeles. And the owner decided to sell it, so she bought it for like $50, $15 at auction. And she ran the California Eagle. And she fought the KKK, she fought redlining, housing discrimination, you name it. I mean, she was fearless. And so there was this element that was around. It wasn't part of the mainstream media, but it was a daily. It was not a daily. It was a weekly. But she was very influential, and she actually was nominated by what's called then the Progressive Party to be vice president, and that was in 1952. So she was quite a woman.
Are you going to write a sequel, continuing the road, rebuilding the road, onward?
I don't know. I mean, a sequel on this book. I mean, we could do some updating if we wanted to. I mean, obviously, what we did do is we turned this book into a book aimed at middle schoolers. And so we have a book. It's called The Time Travelers. Did not bring it, but as a matter of fact, which is aimed at middle schoolers, and it has a lot of these same stories in it. And if you're interested, Time Travelers is being sold on the website of the Friends of the California Archives. Both of us are on the board. And so you can go on there and buy Time Travelers. I think we're charging $10 for it or something like that, which is obviously a very good price. Yes?
I want to thank you for going into history to find out how some women that we never heard about made inroads. So I want to know, how many hours did you put into research and how long a time had you started this book?
Okay, so we wrote our first book, which was, I told you, Game Changers, 12 Elections That Transformed California. And we were very lucky with that. It won the annual California Historical Society Book Award. And that took us probably, we wrote that in a hurry because we were on a deadline, probably a year or so. This one was probably about the same. But in terms of the research, we just went far and wide. And I'll just give you one quick example. Online, I found a master's thesis from a student at Cal State Hayward. And he was talking about some women's issues and suffrage. And remember that quote I used with Mary McHenry Keith out of Berkeley, where she said, she was so mad after that 1896 defeat, she said, "Isn't there something in the Bible about taking the kingdom of heaven by force?" I love that quote, and I wanted to use that quote, but I wanted to find it first to make sure it was accurate. I didn't want to just take somebody else's word for it. So I went to the state library, and they have some Berkeley Gazettes, but they didn't have a Berkeley Gazette going back to 1906. And I went to some other sources, and they could not find a Berkeley Gazette going back to 1906, and the Berkeley Gazette doesn't exist anymore. So I figured out I've got to find the source before I use it. So I found somewhere that the library, one of the many libraries at the University of California at Berkeley, had Berkeley Gazettes going back that far. So we drove all the way down to Berkeley, went to the library there just to verify one quote, and then came back. So we did a lot of research, and we wanted to make sure that everything was accurate. And I'm going to put in a plug. as I mentioned, both of us are members of the board of the California Archives, Friends of the California Archives. They have a great collection, not only that they did, but also that the Bancroft Library in Berkeley did, of oral histories. Many of them are online. And these oral histories are gems, because they interview politicians after they retire, so they don't feel they have to be political or make a point that way. They just tell it the way they believe it happened. And you get some great, great stories, and we use them in both of our books from these oral histories. And you can actually go to the State Archives reading room, which is downtown, and read them yourself, or most of them are online. Thank you.